This is the first of a series of lectures or essays which are meant to display the problems and inadequacies with the mechanistic philosophy or with the scientific outlook. And this is coming from an Aristotelian perspective. Indeed, I will also contend with the new science or with science as such, even within the domain of physics. But first, we will have to deal with science or that paradigm as a philosophy, as that I find to be an immediate problem. So this might be thought of as an Aristotelian contention against scientific materialism in that worldview, the scientific worldview, the mechanistic worldview. But to characterize the scientific outlook as plainly materialist doesn't specify enough as to the lengths they go in that direction, that they're even worse than materialists from my perspective, from the Aristotelian perspective. And we shall have to know why they exclude from objectivity anything metaphysical. Why should scientific materialism exclude anything metaphysical from objectivity? And the answer lays in the procedures of the new science, and they're rearranging the subject of physics. They're rearranging what was Aristotelian physics as an exact mathematical science, where we find that, and this is what I mean by the mechanistic philosophy as being even worse than just materialism, because materialism claims that there is not anything that exists separate from physical bodies. But the mechanistic philosophy, and indeed the scientific presuppositions, exclude even qualities from existing, not in the sense even that they exist as separate from physical bodies, but that they aren't even properties of physical bodies. And so this is all part of their reducing physics to an exact science, of which qualities, for instance, and substantial forms or kinds of substances have no part. Since that is the standard for certain knowledge, as they think, that also becomes a standard, that epistemological criteria of an exact mathematical physics, which cut back most of what was previously denominated as physics, then becomes a standard for any other discipline. It is accompanied by a corresponding metaphysical arrangement in which only those things which can factor into a mathematical equation, only things that can be measured, distances, weights, speeds, sizes, only those things have an objective existence. They even deny the existence of qualities, which they think are subjective phenomena. as well as species and kinds of things. For they go much further than even what was once called materialism. So the difficulty with this is that there is a philosophical paradigm, philosophical positions which are presupposed epistemologically and metaphysically by an exact mathematical science. And that those pervade the modern outlook and are incredibly dangerous. Whilst also what they even consider to be physics seems quite strange from an Aristotelian perspective. And we would even contend with them in physics, which we shall find would actually be contending with them within mechanics. For Aristotelian physics was not the same discipline as the new science. The new science had not the same subject matter as Aristotelian physics. And that is where the significant exclusions of what is objective, of excluding qualities from objectivity, even as properties of physical bodies. That occurs as a definition of what physics is, or what should not be, what cannot be mathematically or rather mechanistically formulated. For the 17th century, quote unquote, natural philosophers and regular philosophers, as Descartes is at the head of this, were trying to restrict physics to what can factor into a mathematical equation, or really a mechanistic, or what can factor into the science of mechanics. Those were the variables and the concepts which are relevant to mechanics, to ancient and medieval mechanics, which are allowed to factor into physics. Everything else is deemed beyond the permitted bounds of certainty. For Aristotelian physics the questions of Aristotelian physics do not come down to an algebraic formula. Nor are the questions with which the new science was set relevant to Aristotelian physics. They are completely different subjects. And why is that? There was a subject matter designated as physics. Aristotelian physics concerns the principles of nature, of whether or not motion is continuous or discrete. An attempt to solve the paradoxes of Zeno, of concerns about whether when water evaporates and becomes air, whether one substance ceases to be and another comes to be, or whether a substance underlying both merely undergoes an alteration. But the new science was quick to dispose of the paradigm of substance and accidents, or substance and properties, of essential properties and accidental properties. and to only allow within physics any things that can be formulated mathematically, measurable quantities, even of physical bodies. They're not Platonists. They care not about Euclidean geometry. Descartes' algebra and Leibniz's and Newton's calculus were at the expense of pure mathematics. Those were meant to solve physical problems. And physics, or the new science, preferably, was meant to restrict anything that couldn't factor into an algebraic formula. Whilst Aristotle came up with the concept of a substance in order to solve the problem of whether or not there is anything that underlies change, whether or not there is a continuity of identity through change. That is why he formed the concept of substance. Else, any change of an accidental quality, the change of a liquid from cold to warm, would be a change of the substance. The substance would also cease to be what it is by becoming something different. The substance, by becoming warm, would become different than it is, and so would cease to be what it is and become what it is not, a different substance. So Aristotle distinguished between a substance which underlies change in order to preserve continuity of identity through change, that these changes, some changes, are of accidental properties. Those are the sorts of questions about the principles of nature, or the principles of physics, which Aristotelian physics is concerned. The new science does not even contend with Aristotelian physics. We have this idea of whether or not heavier bodies fall faster or not. First of all, they're speaking about through a void. There is never a direct contention between sciences of different subject matters. What was previously denominated as physics and metaphysics also were just written off, were just dismissed as irrelevant. And that dismissal, or reducing physics to an exact mathematical science, is what also excludes from objectivity anything which cannot be mathematically formulated. For the new science was designed and modeled after the science of mechanics, which was a mixed mathematical science and was an exact science. The standard with which they restricted physics to and all knowledge to were already prevalent in medieval and ancient, in the medieval and ancient worlds. Those were the mixed mathematical sciences, optics, astronomy, and especially mechanics. That provided them with the standard of exactitude. and certainty, as those were demonstrated geometrically and carried the certainty of geometric proofs, which somehow became algebraic calculations. So we find that what variables or concepts are relevant to the science of mechanics, things that can be measured, weights, distances, positions, speeds, are the sorts of things which physics became restricted to, or which the new science admitted, whilst refusing objectivity and knowledge about anything else. That's how they get to the point of refusing the objectivity of qualities, because qualities play no role in the science of mechanics, which was what the new science was restricted to. They didn't want anything to do with dialectic disputations, which comprise much of Aristotelian physics. The standoff between Aristotelian physics and the new science of the 17th century does not come down to whether or not something's a fact. So we have to look at this as a worldview. They merely write off anything that cannot factor into a mechanical geometrical demonstration as subjective phenomena. And even the idea that physics has to do with whether or not something's a fact shows how prevalent and unavoidable the scientific outlook or the mechanistic philosophy is. Aristotelian physics has nothing to do with that. This part will cover more so the scientific outlook and the consequences of that worldview, of the mechanistic worldview, which is, I think, the most prevalent problem of modernity and is at the heart of the myth of progress. Science is progressive. Science has always been progressive. In the times of Galileo and Descartes, science was progressive. In the times of Darwin, science was progressive. In the times now of environmentalism, also science is progressive. The myth of progress is part of or comes from the mechanistic worldview and the scientific outlook. Elsewhere in the next lecture, I will consider the mechanistic philosophy as a philosophy, the problem with the distinction between qualities as subjective and the mechanistic aspects as objective, for example. While this will sort of briefly cover more so the scientific outlook or the general problems of having used a mathematical physics as a standard and the only standard of knowledge, and having basically lost the liberal arts, metaphysics, ethics, politics, the fine arts, at the expense or in exchange for technology, which I find to be a pathetic claim to advancement and progress. When having cut from education the liberal arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, we see an obvious decline in English diction and the ability to speak and write. We find that great literary works are no longer written and that there is a general incompetence in speech. But what could be a sign of decadence more so than a loss of the sophistication of speech or the ability or talent to speak well? There is no more clear sign of decadence and unintelligence than that. Hence, the word dumb refers to the inability to speak well. But we think that with science and technology, we are not lacking in knowledge in any other field that we can do without the arts. From this, we get the concept or the prevalence of the idea of man as an economic unit in politics, that is a direct consequence of the invasion into human domains of a quantified physics, or of the standards of a quantified physics, or of those as the relevant variables for everything else. For these sorts of sciences, which are like behavioralism, sociology, and modern psychology, presuppose man to be not an agent. Politics are seen as, or members of a polity are seen as not acting, but as responding to stimuli of which the only relevant variables are economic statistics. That it is presupposed that economic statistics determine sociological behavior. And they quite explicitly state that these sciences, quote unquote, presuppose that there is no free will. But even beyond that sense of free will, that man is not an agent, that there's no active behavior. That is not a reaction to stimuli of chemicals in the brain. We find this in neurology and all of these sciences which give the air of a sense of super advancement, that the many think that these fields like neurology are the super advanced fields, super advanced disciplines, when they presuppose that the processes of thought are determined by chemical reactions, that man is a mechanism, that even the processes of thought are mechanistic. That is the invasion of mechanistic physics and those relevant variables into the human domain, which again occurs because they refuse to admit into physics anything that can't factor into a mathematical equation. So then they turn, after writing off the other disciplines, after writing off ethics and politics and metaphysics as things make-believe or impossible to obtain certainty about, they then put in their place a sort of scientific version, a quantified behavioral science, which only sees the variables which factor into rational mechanics of weights, measurements, of only things that can be measured, distances, speeds, sizes, not even qualities. That is why this is a problem worse than just materialism. Materialists would admit that qualities are objective properties of bodies. They don't even admit that. Everything that is not a mechanistic, measurable aspect of things is to them subjective phenomena. Thus, they turn on the human domain and quite explicitly, even from the time of Descartes, think that animals are machines. That nature is inert, that nature is inactive because mechanics, the rational mechanics of Archimedes has only the mechanistic measurable attributes of things as relevant. So restricting physics to that, they also restrict the possibility of knowledge and objectivity to those things. And turning to the human domain, consider in neurology that chemical reactions are responsible for deterministically that the processes of thought are determined and of passions are determined reactions or responses to chemical stimuli or to mechanistic as the living thing as a mechanism. And this is responsible for the putrefaction of aesthetics, of the total unaware, of the total decline of the arts, of a blindness to history and to myths, as well as to things like metaphysics, which is now obviously been time and again declared as something of which knowledge is impossible. And the refusal that value judgments can be true or false, that value judgments even have an objective meaning. That is a direct outgrowth of the mechanistic philosophy, now prevalent in contemporary philosophy, that the only sorts of statements which can be true or false are those which can be empirically verified or even probably measured. So this will briefly cover the scientific outlook, so to speak, and the next one will cover the mechanistic philosophy as a philosophy. And then I'll get into what the new science was even the science of, since the topics, the questions, the sorts of answers are entirely different than what was previously known as physics and are quite similar, if not the same, at least the variables and the sorts of allowed concepts are the same as what was mechanics for Archimedes. That we have been surrounded by the sort of worldview of an engineer. The sort of worldview of engineers is what we would call scientific materialism is. A philosophy or presuppositions drawn from what are the relevant concepts and allowable concepts or the relevant variables of mechanics. Then a philosophy drawn from that. So to begin, one remark I have often heard, which illustrates the total absence of reflection in our age, is that science has amassed an aggregate of assured facts, the perimeter of which outlines the limit of certain knowledge. Nothing that falls outside the conglomerate of scientific facts, they say, can be an object of assured knowledge. And so all knowledge is simply attributable to science. The ages of the past did not contribute anything to knowledge. Aristotle, they say, simply didn't care to check if heavier earthen bodies fall faster than lighter ones, and that the ingenuity of the scientific outlook was merely to check if something's a fact. That sort of opinion, I'm afraid, reveals that we have lost track of what even was significant about the new science of the 17th century. Yet another peculiar occurrence which raises suspicion about the lack of reflection in modernity is that although science is presented as limited to a specific domain, the scientific outlook predominates as a worldview. I mean that domains outside of physics and perhaps chemistry are either dismissed altogether or are only acknowledged within a mechanistic framework. Fields such as ethics, politics, and the kinds of psychology which was once reserved for philosophers are first dismissed as being unscientific, and after which sorts of 19th century inventions such as quantitative psychology, behavioral science, and sociology are put in their place, which have suspicious theoretical foundations and overtly reductive procedures. I mean that behaviorism and modern psychology presuppose that people are without self-agency or free will and reduce them to mechanisms which deterministically respond to external stimuli, having lost, as they have, any ideals and standards of virtue, honor, and shame, and anything which is resistant to a quantified science. As the procedures of quantified science intrude in on the human domain, they represent the attempt to quantify human processes and activities, which is often as crudely performed as statistical analysis, which refuses to acknowledge any idealistic aspects. Now, although attempts in such fields never carry with them the kind of finality which physics aims for, since statistics, with which they are always concerned in quantifying human behavior, is an accounting-like analysis aimed at probability, at mere probability. And since the task of quantifying human behavior is unrealistic, although that is the case, they do have the dangerous consequence of molding fundamental ideas outside of the standard domains of science. The political conception of man as an economic unit is most certainly an effect of the process of conforming all topics and subject matters to the procedures of quantified physics. History, for example, is likewise warped by requirements to provide archaeological evidence for historical figures and events which are obviously unavailable, the figures of which, however, have always been thought to have really existed. An appeal to technology is not sufficient to argue for progress and advancement, nor to justify science. Again, an appeal to technology is not sufficient to argue for progress and advancement, nor to justify science, when the classical liberal arts are dismissed as irrelevant and rhetoric disposed with them, such as to guarantee and further ensure the steep decline in English diction, whereby politicians are incompetent orators. Politicians are incompetent in oratory. Great literary works are no longer composed, not even attempted. And through, there is a continual loss and decline in the skills of speaking and composition. There is not a more telltale sign of decadence and decline, in my opinion, than a decrease in competence in the English language or in speech in general, which is obvious to anyone who has read anything prior to the 20th century. Nor do I think cultural decadence persists without a deficiency in grammar, rhetoric, and logic, since great literary works and artistic pieces have to be confronted in that sort of curriculum. But that could only occur under a false sense of security provided by scientific knowledge. That scientific knowledge is sufficient to a society, that science is the only standard of intelligence, wisdom, and knowledge. Our idea of what makes an educated person and what sorts of things education is for have been utterly distorted. But that has occurred under the watchful guidance of science, which by appealing to things like standards of living to convince of progress, at once quantifies man or dehumanizes him. As such an appeal is blind to artistic beauty and other forms of personal and civilizational excellence, even ideas of freedom, which we cannot even grasp nowadays, but which would have been the norm for even a feudal peasant or pre-industrial craftsman. Thus, when appealing to things like standards of living, they are appealing to the quantification of life. They are blind to anything else. By trying to convince us that we have a better standard of living with technology and anything else, they are even then viewing human life as something quantifiable, as having no standards outside of economic statistics. The scientific outlook or the mechanistic philosophy is indeed blind in many respects and is dumb in even more than the sense of being incapable of literary composition and rhetoric. The false sense of progress which appeals to technology to justify science, and the false sense of science which appeals to technology to justify progress, has turned myths and historical stories which lived in the hearts of men into petrified fossils, sterilizing every ideal, value, and standard of excellence. What could give rise to a worldview in which certainty is restricted to mathematical physics, whilst ethics is cast off as unscientific, as a matter of opinion and custom, and metaphysics is deemed make-believe, about which knowledge wouldn't even be possible? Even philosophy is disowned as obsolete within the scientific paradigm. But what great heedlessness, what careless naivety and directionlessness to suppose there to be nothing gained from taking counsel in philosophy, to exclude ethics and metaphysics from the possibility of knowledge and certainty. Only a civilization that would welcome its own destruction would contrast the certain knowledge attainable in mathematical physics with what they call the subjectivity of values and ideals. But many of us have already witnessed and noted the utter collapse of aesthetics. Many of us see through the naive progressivism that attends the mechanistic worldview. We distinctly note that the scientific outlook has to be responsible for the humiliating decline of architecture. Something which you might think would be conformable to a mathematical science. What else could explain that contemporary architecture is incommensurably worse than medieval and especially Renaissance architecture, than that there is a hollowness to the mechanistic worldview that cannot even grasp ideals, which is blind to aesthetic beauty? Yet none detect the imminent danger of a civilization whose intellectuals think value judgments to be something contrasted with meaning and validity. That value judgments have not even a meaning to be either true or false. That is the 21st century, and that was the 20th century opinion in contemporary philosophy. And yet, although philosophy is thought to be something irrelevant, the presuppositions of the scientific outlook predominate as a philosophy, not as a restricted field. A certain epistemology, a certain metaphysics are everywhere presupposed, almost unawares, which do not restrict themselves to physics, but invasively work towards dissembling any remains of the civilization which do not conform to the mechanistic worldview. Science does not operate only within the limited domain of physics and the subordinate natural sciences, but spreads like an infectious plague against most notably theology, metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, and the arts. For each of those subjects are re-evaluated within a mechanistic framework. In a previous age, theology was thought to be able to attain certain knowledge and would have met the standards of logical proofs. The scientific outlook instead compels theology to produce propositions which can be empirically verified, or more accurately, which can be measured and factored into an algebraic equation. Thus, a peculiar epistemological criteria is set forth from the confines of mathematical physics into subjects like ethics and other branches of philosophy in a way that debilitates them, as they can obviously not be conformed and reduced to quantitative and mechanistic relations. So they are also dismissed as matters of custom and opinion. Even epistemology, even within philosophy, although permitted to carry on, is dismissed as aloof and irrelevant, since the scientific outlook is settled as to what amounts to certain knowledge, and since metaphysics is ignored as something fanciful, make-believe, and impossible to obtain certainty about. However much the scientific method might be presented as something of an instrument designated to the subject of physics. Even whatever the scientific method of mathematical physics may be, is inseparable from the presupposed epistemological and metaphysical leanings which characterize the mechanistic philosophy of the 17th century.